Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So we are finally at the end of the sketchbook. So we have one last page, which is kind of the inside back cover, which I like to kind of match with the front inside cover as well. So I already have a sketch already done because I wanted to take my time just planning it out without having to worry about keeping myself in frame of my camera. So I have already sketched it out in a very light color red, and I kind of have it mirroring my front page. So Masaki's in the bottom left rather than the bottom right. I'll also have the text on the upper right rather than the upper left. So yeah, but I guess like the proportions of it is a little bit different. Masaki is a lot larger in the front page and the one on the back page is a lot smaller, but I do kind of like this a little bit more because I could play around with the simplicity of the Clovers later. So for the sketch itself, I used the Uni 0.5 red lead instead of my palette Color ENO, and it was just more like coincidence for using it. Also, like I said, I'm gonna put text on this kind of back pocket portion, so it kind of just works out because painting on this part of the pocket is kind of a nightmare, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So before we can get to painting, there are a few steps that I like to take before we actually paint with gouache, because I like to match the mediums if I can. I know there was one other spread where I didn't do that. I think I did alcohol markers instead of gouache for one of my HIMI kind of front and back inside covers, but if I can, I like to match the medium and kind of match the theme. So because this one is Masaki themed and I already had an inkling that I wanted this to have him, I don't know, either darker color scheme, but also his eyes being closed, maybe just having goodbye, making it a little bit simpler might be a little bit better for what I was going for a goodbye or a concluding page to the sketchbook. But the first step before I start to paint is the sketching portion has to be kind of prepared. So like I said, I sketched with the Uni 0.5 red lead initially, and I go ahead and start to use the Pirsmacolor Col-Eraser to do much more cleaner lines. You can see that I'm doing a little bit of small adjustments here and there to his jaw, and I'm gonna have to really shave in his jaw quite a bit once we start painting. But this allows me to make the lines a little bit more permanent, if anything, because sometimes I get a little bit wary on whether or not my lighter sketch gets dissolved by the water or by the paint. But even so, even if it doesn't really dissolve, like I could use normal graphite. Depending on the intensity of it, sometimes I can't really see my lines when I do the initial washes. So something that pops out enough but also doesn't disrupt the entire piece is kind of nice. So I like using kind of a red color because it tends to blend in with my paints nicely. But I also noticed when I start to do my watercolor washes, which will be the next step, that I noticed the red of the Uni 0.5 red lead, basically it doesn't really dissolve or disappear as much as my palette Color ENO one. So I don't know if it's just the composition of the lead is just a little bit different, but I like to be a little bit cautious, so I definitely still like to do the kind of more cleaner sketch with more of a harder, more prominent color so that we don't get too lost. And you'll see right here when I'm placing down my watercolor washes that I'm not really caring too much whether or not certain colors are like staying within the lines or anything like that. I'm basically using this step to kind of, one, map out color, and then two, kind of prime the paper a little bit for the gouache itself, because sometimes I feel like the paper, when there's no kind of like roughness to it, or maybe you have your oils from your hands, or just kind of that glossy nature of a fresh new sheet of paper, especially this paper, I feel like it kind of doesn't let the watercolor or paint flow as nicely. It kind of becomes a little bit splotchy, and I feel like even though gouache is very opaque and you can use it in a more thick manner, sometimes the consistency of it works a little bit better, at least to me, is when I add a base of watercolor down so that it has something to grip to, because the watercolor kind of primes the paper and the fibers a little bit. Instead of having that really smooth texture of the paper, it kind of gets a little bit of grit onto it, which is something that just I prefer when doing kind of like my steps for painting in my sketchbook like this. I really haven't been painting with gouache. I mentioned this probably in the last session, and I don't know if I was clear enough. So the thing is that I do want to paint more with gouache because I do like it as a medium, and the end result tends to be very clean and polished, or it can be very painterly. You can definitely do a lot of textures, or you can make it really clean and refined looking. Kind of depends on how you like to paint and probably your style of just how you handle a brush and stuff. But for me, I haven't been painting a whole lot in the sketchbook in general, and when I do, it tends to be watercolor washes here and there, and then I wouldn't really tackle anything with gouache because I've been a little bit intimidated by using gouache because of my lack of patience with it, but I still wish to use it more frequently, probably in the next sketchbook or on other watercolor paper or something like that, because I want to get used to the medium. And the good thing about this paper compared to some other ones is the fact that this paper is just one, it's very warm paper, so it feels very inviting for me to paint on, and I do kind of like the color scheme to be a little bit warmer whenever I paint with gouache for some reason. But also the paper is just much thicker. It's thicker, it doesn't buckle as much, it's very smooth. So the watercolor washes initially laid down very nicely for me to manage. And then when I added in the gouache, I didn't really feel like the paper was buckling or warping or getting like bumpy or anything like that. So it's just easier for me to manage. But I feel like I just need to take my time and paint again, because I did have a lot of fun doing this portion of the painting, which I have now switched to gouache. So once I've let the watercolor kind of settle and dry completely, I missed filming a portion of it, which is me kind of filling in the background a little bit with several different little kind of splotchy brushstrokes of green, so that we can get a very, I don't know, a really messy gradient of a dark green to light green as we move outwards to the upper right from the bottom left. And that'll kind of prep me a little bit for how I want to have the clovers from dark to light, basically. But for Masaki, I do like to start with the face. So I was being a little bit cautious, so my very first layer of gouache was very watery, but it was also very pale, so I didn't get the skin tone correct at the very beginning, so I did another layer. But as I'm painting and building up layers, I'm also kind of low-key adding a little bit of shading that's a little bit more akin to line work, because as I started to build up the layers and add more color, or just like kind of thickening up that paint, I started to lose my lines almost immediately, and I was scared of botching up his face, because I think that's partially another reason why I don't like gouache, because I have such a little control, whereas something like the face, I like having a lot of control. I like having a good idea of how to handle the medium and be able to do certain details so that the face doesn't turn out wonky. Otherwise, I would probably spend way too much time trying to fix it up and trying to cover it with any other kind of means. I think in the past, there was a sketchbook spread where I did botch up the face really badly and I had to paint over it, and I think I covered it up like several times, but I don't know. I luckily didn't really run into that problem, so I did try my best to take kind of the pink shadow color that I initially had for Masaki's face and kind of blocked in where his eyes was, his nose, his mouth shape, so that later on when I do add in the line work, it won't be too much of me being lost on where to place things. Also, one thing I really like about gouache, and sometimes it's a hit or miss for me because I'm very inconsistent, but hair. I really do enjoy painting hair for some reason. I don't know if it's the idea of starting off with the kind of base color and then kind of pushing your shapes by getting kind of darker values, and then you can pull out other shapes by adding more highlights. It's just something nice about it, even though my brain definitely prefers still working from light to dark. But it's a little bit closer to how I like to paint with digital rather than my traditional work, where I tend to work light to dark, but when traditional, I kind of put down a base color and then sometimes I put shadows, sometimes I put highlights, and I kind of do a back and forth. But yeah, I kind of liked how simple his hair turned out. I ended up not doing any line work for his hair per se, so what you see for the hair right now is kind of what it's gonna end up looking like. I know for his face, it's gonna go for a little bit more chipping at the jaw and chin area because I made it really uneven. So I'm gonna try my best to kind of fix it up right here, and hopefully it works a little bit better. Luckily, it's not too skewed. Oh, I also noticed I am going to forget to put Masaki's mole for the longest time, even though I think at this point is when I told myself like, oh, don't forget to do Masaki's mold after you finish painting in the hand, because I can still use the same line work color and paint it in his mole, but I'll forget to do it until like the very end. I think it's because I was waiting for the chin and kind of like the jaw and neck area to be completely dry, because I've been accidentally placing my hand into the paint several times during this session just because I was impatient of when I was painting in the clovers. But yeah, I don't know. It's like I said, I need to have more patience whenever I paint with a medium like this. This is kind of like one of my favorite parts also. So I started to get more of that mid-tone color for Masaki's hair and kind of pulling back those parts for the bangs and stuff. And it came to be a little bit more painterly looking, but I like how it turned out because of how I chunked in the hair. So it looks kind of pretty and I like the texture of it. I also tried my best to add extra little wispy bits here and there, just because if a person's laying down, usually their hair kind of like falls across their face or on their face rather than just like if you're standing vertically up. So I wanted to have a little bit more flyaways and things like that. Trying to think what else, because this piece kind of makes me want to paint a little bit more. Oh wait, I can show you guys what my paint what is it called, my gouache case, my gouache paints, what they look like before and after I did this painting session, because I haven't used my paints in a super long time, and because of that some of them got a little bit more crusty and very dry, so I decided to revive them a little bit and clean them up just a smidge so that I wasn't creating little craters into the center of my little paint jelly cups. So yeah, and you'll probably see which colors I use the most, and I don't know, I think this might revitalize my spirit to want to draw and paint more with gouache, just because I'm liking what the hair looks like. I don't mind the face. The clovers will become very fun once we actually get to that portion, but I had a lot of fun actually painting his sweater or his turtleneck too, because I don't usually paint like that. I usually paint a little bit more controlled and very a little bit more akin to my digital, so I definitely rely a lot also on the line work. But for the sweater and his hair, I think I left it to be a little bit more painterly than I usually approach painting with gouache, because like I said, I like having control whenever it comes to drawing, and I like things to be a little bit more clean and crisp if I can, or keeping things a little bit more refined in certain areas like the face, or like I like having some extra line work to help bring together the entire drawing. But this one's a little bit looser, which I think is something that I really needed, and hopefully it won't get too bogged down. It might be also because his eyes are closed, so I don't really have to focus on his face too much, because the face I think also causes me the most grief, even though it's like my favorite part to draw every time. But for the clover portion, so for the clovers, I decided that I'll mix a dark green and gradually add more light colors, and we'll move away from the really dark green area up into like the mid-tone to the lighter area, and we'll just kind of go back and forth so that I can have a gradual transition from the dark clovers and slowly layer in a lot of the lighter greens so we can create a little bit more depth. I definitely think the ones from the front page of the sketchbook, I'm gonna take a quick look, but they had much more vibrant greens and a little bit more I don't know how to explain the shapes of them, a little bit of a different shape rather than how I drew or painted in the clover shapes for this one, which tends to be just 3 circles together. And I don't know, the depth of the one from the front page I definitely like a lot, but there's just something about this one that feels a little bit more soft, and it might have to do with the fact that the contrast isn't as high compared to the one that I did before, and it might be because I added in more darker greens to kind of push the other midtones and the lighter ones to kind of be more in the front rather than in the back. I also was a little bit too meek about painting this time around, so I didn't really add too much colorful reflective light into his hair or into his clothing. There's very little on his sweater where I added a little bit of a hint of purple here and there, but I didn't add too much because I was a little bit scared of ruining the piece at this point. But the last few things were kind of little embellishments here and there for the entire piece. So I'm taking a brush and dotting in some little white dust particles or whatever you want to call these, and we'll add some glowing effects to it after, but some of these need to dry a little longer, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to marker and do the text. So I don't trust myself painting in the text with gouache. I could probably do it in watercolor if I can plan it out a little bit more correctly and a little bit more patiently, but I like using a drawing medium if I have to pretend to know how to do calligraphy to some extent. So alcohol marker probably work the best, and that's what I did for the front page. So I kind of used a apple green kind of color, which is a little bit more of a yellowy green to kind of match the aesthetic. I'll add in a little bit of shadow here and there on the text, and then I'll go ahead and use kind of a cool gray to add in drop shadow, and we'll use a colorless blender to kind of blend out the text shadow a little bit more. It's kind of interesting that the colorless blender kind of gives it this warm hue, which I think looks kind of pretty, but later on when it actually dries, it doesn't really show up as much, so it'll just be that kind of cool gray. Back to the little dust particles. So to add kind of a glowing effect, I like to take a old brush. So this is an old acrylic brush that I used to use, but I don't mind kind of letting it get beat up, or I don't really have to keep it in like pristine condition. You basically take very little amount of paint. You can swirl it around a little bit on a piece of paper or any kind of dry, clean surface to kind of spread around the paint a little bit so it's not too concentrated, and you can really just beat it right into the page and kind of brush it kind of harshly until it kind of gives a hazy effect onto your desired place. So up close you can kind of see where the little paint marks are, but from far away it actually looks like it's glowing, which I think looks really cute. Yeah, I just think it's kind of a fun way to add a little bit of glowing particles here and there if you want to do it for gouache painting. Oh, also, this is where I remembered that I need to put in Masaki's mole. So I went ahead, mixed up some paint, which happened to be a little bit too dark, and then I made his mole too big. I tried to lift up some of that paint so it's not as prominent. But let me show you guys the little bit of close-ups of the actual finished back spread before I show you guys the comparison and the overall spread. So yeah, I think that's it for the sketchbook though. So next not next Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday, so like in 2 days, I'll have a sketchbook tour for you guys, and the following Monday I will be starting the new sketchbook, which I'm gonna try my best to think of what I want to do for the front and back cover or inside cover, so I can kind of plan accordingly. I haven't started it yet, even though I finished the sketchbook actually a little while ago. So here's the back spread and the front spread. Also, I have a lid under this portion of the sketchbook so that I could even it out. Yeah, so very vibrant, much more blue greens right here, and then the back side has much more of a warmer aesthetic. I didn't notice that I painted his cardigan the wrong color, so his cardigan here is kind of more of a dusty grayish beige color, and then here I kind of went more of a ochre brown for his sweater, which I still think it kind of fits with this overall aesthetic, and I think it looks really cute. So yeah, front cover, back cover, and the sketchbook is done. So I'll talk to you guys on Wednesday with the sketchbook tour. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!